Hello, my name is Tim Nordgren, and here I'll be sharing with you about compelling evidence and how we know the things most surely believed. Luke 1:1. Now, as Christians, we are given a charge in 1 Peter 3:15. But sanctify Christ as Lord in your hearts, always being ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you to give an account for the hope that is in you, yet with gentleness and reverence. Now, the word defense in the Greek is apologia, which is the basis for the concept of apologetics. That is, believers offer reasons for our hope to believe the claims of the scriptures so we can share the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Also make sure to take note of the other underlying words, gentleness and reverence. First, please allow me to share a little bit about my own background. I had the privilege of working for over 45 years in engineering, with the last 40 years at Philips Ultrasound as a medical product design engineer. I have a Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of Washington, where I also studied the history and philosophy of science. At Philips, I worked in teams that developed many of the world's first and leading diagnostic medical ultrasound products, and I'm named on a number of patents for innovations in ultrasound. If you or a family member ever had a Philips ultrasound scan, cardiovascular, abdominal, musculoskeletal, and more, then it's most likely that the transducer applied to the body, the cable that carries the signal, the connector to the system, the electronics, structure, control panel, display, or all the above have been touched or designed by me. Because of this technology, when my daughter was developing in the womb, they found a grapefruit-sized fibroid cyst competing for space, which required surgery at 5 months of gestation. The surgery was successful for my wife and daughter because of the use of ultrasound before and after the procedure. More recently, my father-in-law had an aortic heart valve replaced while simultaneously monitored with a 3D matrix ultrasound transducer placed in his esophagus. I was on the team that developed this first ever breakthrough technology. A few years later, my wife's cancer was detected utilizing a transducer and system for which I had contributed to the design. In July of 2025, ultrasound was used to confirm that she remains in remission. Now the images on this display. In the upper left are just 6 of the many generations of ultrasound systems I mentioned earlier. In the upper right, the first ultrasound system for brain surgery. In the top middle are 3 variants of the first sterilizable ultrasound transducers with a plaque for one of 3 patents associated with those designs. In the lower left is a 3D ultrasound of my granddaughter, born in 2008, and then afterwards with her mother. In the lower right is the current state of 3D ultrasound for an unborn baby. And in the middle bottom is a 4D ultrasound video of a mitral valve in the heart for the first ever real-time 3D matrix transesophageal echocardiographic probe. Now, I'm retired from my career, but once an engineer, always an engineer. So today I come as a design advocate, sharing how I believe that God created the universe and you for his good purpose. So, the task of an apologist is to offer evidence that leads to faith in Christ. However, what order of evidence should we expect before trusting the God of the Bible? We sometimes hear skeptics assert that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We see that here from the infamous atheist Richard Dawkins from his screed, The God Delusion. These same skeptics demand that until compelling evidence is supplied, they are justified to reject faith. Now, in order to sustain such an assertion, they must first brush aside the many classical evidences for faith in God. First, the origin and beginning of the universe. Second, the fine-tuning of the universe. Third, the sudden appearance of life. Fourth, the intelligent design and irreducible complexity of life. Fifth, the biblical origin for science. Sixth, the archaeological evidence for the Bible. 7, fulfilled biblical prophecy. 8, the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and much, much more. Each of these evidences is extremely strong in its own right, but taken together, they are more than sufficient to convince anyone open to the truth. However, there must always be a way to choose unbelief. If it were not so, there would be no free will. Freedom must be a genuine possibility. Therefore, though we may seek compelling evidence, we can never demand compelled evidence. That is because the God of the Bible is not some kind of cosmic UFC fighter who pounds and strangles us until we finally tap out. Here we should consider the example of Jacob, who was actually commended for wrestling with God. And after God tested that his faith had matured, he gave him a new name, We see this in Genesis 32:28. Then he said, "Your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Now at any time God could have slammed Jacob to the mat and forced him to submit to his infinitely superior power. Yet he did not. He gave Jacob the freedom to wrestle with the very will of his Creator. And because of this, Jacob did finally grow to believe in and trust God. Still, some demand that God break into the world to overwhelm all unbelief. They may imagine him ripping open the heavens and booming out, "Don't make me come down there." They may also expect that he enlists the voice talents of Morgan Freeman. Now, such an event may well cause us to cower and shake, but it would not necessarily lead to faith in God. Many would respond like a rebellious child forced to take a time out. I may be sitting down on the outside, but I'm standing up on the inside. So unlike some claims for compelling evidence like atheism and Islam, Christian faith is not compelled. Reason is explained by the brilliant apologist Norman Geisler. He says, God has provided enough evidence in life to convince anyone willing to believe, yet he has also left some ambiguity so as to not compel the unwilling. In this way, God gives us the opportunity to either love him or reject him without violating our freedom. For love by definition must be freely given. It cannot be coerced. Therefore, God has chosen a different means to compel faith. He offers us a changed heart responsive to the compelling love of God. We see this in Romans 5:6-8. For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us in that, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You see, only when we recognize we are sinners deserving eternal punishment, and because of the love of God, Christ died for us, is our heart compelled to respond in faith. This happens through the revelation of God, through the gift of faith. We see this in Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace have you been saved through faith, and this is not of your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast. Here we see that not only is salvation a gift, but so is faith, and it is our responsibility to accept these good gifts from God. So then, why do we offer evidences or reasons for faith if faith is a gift from God? Well, recall that we're commanded to do so in 1 Peter 3:15, which said, always being ready to make a defense. Further, the scriptures, the essential foundation for all valid faith, offer abundant examples of this kind of evidence. These would include the following. First, eyewitness testimony of the resurrection of Christ. In 1 Corinthians 15:6, it says, He, the resurrected Christ, appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive. Next is what's called natural revelation. In Psalm 19:1, it says, The heavens declare the glory of God, and the sky above proclaims his handiwork. Next is God's work in history. History shows he raises up nations and brings them down. Psalm 46:8 summarizes, saying, Come, behold the works of the Lord, how he has brought desolations on the earth. Next is reason. According to Genesis 1:26, we are created in the image of God, and therefore in Isaiah 1:18, he can say, Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Next is the fact of the conscience. According to Romans 2:14-15, for when Gentiles, who do not have the law, by nature do what the law requires, they are law to themselves, even though they do not have the law. They show that the work of the law is written on their hearts, while their conscience also bears witness, and their conflicting thoughts accuse or even excuse them. Next is miracles. The scriptures are full of faith-building miracles. These include miracles of healing, power over nature, power of creation, supernatural wisdom, and much more. I personally have a running list of miracles in my own life that I often bring up to remind myself of the goodness of God. According to Psalm 77:11, it says, I will remember the works of the Lord. Surely I'll remember thy wonders of old. I will be sharing one example of this at the end of this message, so hold on. You see, when offering solid evidence for faith, we're removing unnecessary obstacles. A well-informed Christian can offer many evidences for faith and address countless misconceptions. It will likely take some time, effort, and definitely a lot of patience. We may need to be patient with others and also ourselves. You may need to humbly say, I don't know, but I'm willing to look into that question. I've had to say that many times myself. Yet today, many demand a scientific proof for faith in the God of the Bible. However, some of us realize this is not a valid requirement. You see, the concept of a proof is only valid in mathematics and logic, where you demonstrate that the terms on both sides of the equation, if you will, are equal. There's actually no such thing as a scientific proof. Science only deals with confirming evidence for a hypothesis about naturally recurring processes observed in the present. And all scientific experiments must be repeatable in the present. Whenever we make claims about events in the past, we're dealing with historical theories. Examples include the origin of the universe, the origin of life, the origin of the Greek Empire, and the origin of modern music. Now, this next slide reminds me of an experience I had early in my engineering career. As I walked into the workplace, I saw a couple of my colleagues in a heated debate in the back of the room. The older gentleman, I was going to say he was in his mid-60s, was saying, "You're crazy. Everybody knows that Frank Sinatra was the greatest and had the most important impact on the origin of modern music." Then the other guy, I'm going to say he was probably in his mid-30s, he says, "No, you're wrong. Everybody knows that Elvis was the king of rock and roll and had the most important impact on the origin of modern music." Now, at about that time, I showed up. I was in my early 20s, and I looked at them both and I said, "You're both wrong and crazy. Everyone knows that the Beatles had the most important impact on the origin of modern music." Now, we may all have a preferred origin theory for any of the above, but by definition, these are not scientific theories. However, we've all heard people use the idea of a proof in different ways. For example, we might hear of a prosecutor in court claim they have proof that someone is guilty of murder. So let's consider the following case study. Professor John Doe has been charged with the murder of his wife, Jane. They have found the murder weapon. There's the gun, and it's registered to John Doe. It has his fingerprints all over it, and the DNA analysis proves he's used the gun. The ballistics department has also proven that the bullet was shot from John Doe's gun. Now, some might say that John Doe has been scientifically proven guilty and he's going down for this horrific crime. But what if I told you that John Doe made a dinner reservation for their wedding anniversary after a planned university conference meeting? Next, I tell you that John Doe gave a speech about the results of a cancer research project at that conference meeting, witnessed by over 500 faculty and students at the same time as the shooting of his wife. Now, maybe some of us have seen enough CSI-like crime drama to imagine there might be other things going on here. So I could also add that they found a ripped-up copy of the research team's work in the professor's home and at the apartment of an openly disgruntled grad student. Those grad students, they're always up to something. There could be much more evidence, but this case illustrates how the scientific analysis mentioned, fingerprinting, DNA analysis, ballistics, and others, did not scientifically prove John Doe was guilty of murder. The fact is, all such allegations are properly classified as part of a historical theory, and here the eyewitness testimony far outweighs everything else. Now, I chose the number 500 for a reason. As mentioned above, according to the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15:6, then he, the resurrected Christ, appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. And all the apostles who shared this fact gave their lives for the truthfulness of their testimony about the resurrection of Jesus Christ. By definition, this must all be historical evidence and cannot be scientific evidence. That is because it simply cannot be repeatedly observed in the present. So here is a compelling summary for this case by Chuck Colson, George Washington University trained lawyer and convicted Watergate co-conspirator. He said, "I know that the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus raised from the dead, then they proclaimed that truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. They would not have endured that if it weren't true. On the other hand, Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me that 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. Therefore, you cannot and should not demand a scientific proof for the resurrection of Christ. However, the documentary, circumstantial, historical, logical, and eyewitness testimony are truly compelling. Now, back to a valid definition of science. Is this a scientist or just a pest inspector? Clearly, we need a better definition than a white lab coat. Here, I believe we must watch out for what I call the sophist science shell game. You ask, sophist or sophism? Well, in ancient Greek culture, Plato and Aristotle characterized sophists as paid intellectuals, merchants of knowledge, athletes in a contest of words, who use fallacies to empty the souls of their followers. According to their assessment, sophists did not offer true knowledge, but only what aligned with the current opinion of things. Sound familiar? Today, we can likewise see in the sophist science shell game, they talk about the science of gravity, electricity, chemistry, and all these in the present, and then they swap these out for the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of man. We are told to follow the settled science. Never mind that there's no such thing as settled science. By definition, all science must be tentative. You will then hear believers chant, science-based data-driven, science-based data-driven, science-based data-driven, and then at the crescendo, science is real. And all this is supposed to shut down all further discussion when we refuse to accept the politicizing of science. Here we must reassert that the power of true science is based on the repeatable observation of naturally recurring processes that occur in the present. Now, the nature of historical theories is that they are speculative about events and processes in the past. As seen on the left, usually goes something like long, long ago, far, far away. They may call upon forensic evidence, like we saw in the John Doe courtroom case, but this does not establish a theory is scientifically valid or prove it. Science must always be confirmed by repeated observational evidence acquired in the present. On the other hand, to the right, you are seeing a true scientist who asks the question, are you seeing this in the present? Then other scientists can say, yes, I've confirmed it or not. After this, we must also watch out for any hidden presuppositions that should always be questioned. For example, the common claim that science must be based on naturalism. This is a common fallacy where they simply assume the thing that is to be proven. That is, nature is the cause of nature. Ultimately, this is just another form of atheism. Now, there's a sad and sordid tale about the degeneration of the definition and practice of science. For those interested in the step-by-step historical account of these details, I provided this in my essay titled Creation Agnosticism. I will share a link to this later in the presentation. However, in the interest of time, here I'll present a highly abridged retelling of this devolutionary story with just a few slides. You see, while I don't believe in the evolution of man, I do believe in the devolution of science. Now, you will recall that science was motivated and the discipline founded by Bible-believing scientists. That is, they believed the heavens declare the glory of God, Psalm 19:1. Then came naturalism. Here, with the rise of a substitute for biblical revelation, naturalism was based on the claim that nature itself was a sufficient cause for nature. As we saw, this is just a fallacious argument for atheism. Then came what was called logical positivism, or science is God. Now, at the zenith of what C.S. Lewis called scientism, it was claimed that through logically linked observations, science could explain everything. The new logical positivists went on to claim that anything that could not be described by their new logic was not only non-scientific, it was nonsense. Now, critics pointed out that they had entirely ignored history, yet they pressed on and effectively made science God. In Seattle, you can now see a sign from the freeway saying just that, science is God. But later, on further investigation, the very founders of this philosophical purging program discovered that logical positivism was itself logical nonsense. One of those founders was Rudolf Carnap, who included this little admission in the appendix of his seminal book. Now, one observer of science noted that is highly illogical. Now, next came what is called epistemological anarchism. Now, that's a mouthful, so we just abbreviate with science is anarchy. Now, for Bible believers, epistemology is simply the study of how we know the things we most surely believe, Luke 1:1. But for atheists, this is something entirely different. Now, there are a number of other devolutionary steps. Each one failed in its turn, and each time there was a downgrade in confidence in science. However, one of the most infamous downgrades was proffered by Dr. Paul Feyerabend at UC Berkeley. In his treatise entitled Against Method, he argued there is no superior or even preferred method for the acquisition of knowledge. Any choice of method is equally valid, or more correctly, invalid, since each of the many means of gaining knowledge is radically indeterminate and therefore unworthy of our confidence or trust. Therefore, he brazenly declared, quote, "In science, anything goes." For example, he would say, physics are essentially the same as psychics, chemistry the same as alchemy, astronomy the same as astrology, medicine the same as magic. In short, science is anarchy. Do you remember what Antifa did to Seattle? Well, this is what happened to science through this degenerative step. Now, you might believe that things could not get any worse for science. Well, unfortunately, that is not the case. Next came science as consensus. The current state of affairs has taken a last degenerative step. The modern definition is science as consensus, or we must really just say science is politics. Now, monkeys can't talk, so this is where science actually went bananas. The science as consensus concept was propagated among scientists and then the pop culture by the science historian Thomas Kuhn in his book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. In 1996, I wrote a review of Kuhn's book in my History of Science course at the University of Washington. Here, he set forth his concept of the scientific paradigm. He defined a successful scientific community as a consensus group, possessing a paradigm with increasing professional acknowledgement. The analogy used to illustrate the choice between conflicting views of nature or paradigms is evolutionary natural selection. Therefore, science is advanced through conflict within the scientific community of the fittest way to practice science. In the end, the survival of the fittest consensus group will occur when they dominate by forcing out dissenters through academic appointments, professional blacklisting, and most important, government funding. This is what's called big science. The consensus group confers scientific truth status through a majority vote. As indicated earlier, science is now redefined as politics. So here we have a choice between a scientific vote or observational science. In the case pictured on the left, one guy realizes this is not true, but he needs those big dollars for his research. The guy behind realizes that not voting yes means my career is toast. Only the observational science on the right, conducted in the present, can be called valid science. Sadly, billions and billions of your tax dollars are being used to prop up and reinforce this degenerate view of science. Here is my summary of Kuhn's thesis. Finally, some may object that this view is really not intended to describe how science should be done, but rather how it actually is done. But this does not ring true, since the original claim for this view was that it would define the very structure of the phases of science. Ultimately, with this view of science, none of the results of science may be used to measure another paradigm, since by giving up the concept of objective truth, the result is that the paradigm community or leader now reigns as exclusive arbiter of what will be deemed worthy of scientific truth status. In my view, the science's consensus view is so far from assuring the checks and balances of individual scientific autonomy, it actually invites institutional tyranny. So does any of this sound strangely familiar? Revisionist history, fake news, political narratives, and now consensus science. It should. According to 2 Timothy 4:3-4, for the time is coming when people will not endure sound teaching, but having itching ears, they will accumulate to themselves teachers to suit their own passions, and will turn away from listening to truth and wander off into myths. Now, regarding such evolutionary myths, Stephen Jay Gould, the preeminent Harvard atheist, paleontologist, and ardent evolutionist, chastised Charles Darwin for making up just so stories as a substitute for scientific evidence, that is to say, speculative historical theories. You may remember the fairy tales of Rudyard Kipling's The Jungle Book, but there was also just so stories. Here we learn how the camel got his hump, how the leopard got his spots, how the rhinoceros got his skin, how the elephant got his trunk. How? Well, it happened just so. Now, this was not a creationist saying this, but the preeminent atheist and evolutionist Stephen Jay Gould. Without knowing, his warning confirms that of the Apostle Paul, who said in 1 Timothy 6:20 through 21, O Timothy, keep that which is committed to thy trust, avoiding profane and vain babblings and oppositions of science, or knowledge, falsely so called, which some professing have erred concerning the faith. I believe this explains the history of debate and confusion about creation science versus evolutionary science, pro-life medicine versus pro-abortion medicine, claim consensus about climate change science, epidemiology and public policy, think COVID lockdowns, gender studies where men now can become pregnant, eugenics or doctor-assisted suicide, and much, much more. But now let's pause and reflect. We really must not allow the bad behavior of some to cause us to distrust all of science. As Christians, we must do better. If anything, biblical Christians must advocate for a return to science, that is, true science. We must return to the original incentive for the development of the scientific method and its fruit of technology. We must seek to know and glorify the God of truth. Once again is Psalm 19, verse 1, but now with verse 7 added. The heavens declare the glory of God, the skies proclaim the work of his hands. The law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. Yet many today believe they can't trust anything coming from the realm of science or technology, making themselves vulnerable to conspiracy theories. For example, the pro-life movement has validly utilized ultrasound imaging technology to reveal the facts about the life of unborn children in the womb. However, some politically motivated bad actors actually reject this compelling scientific evidence, claiming it's fabricated to support a political narrative. Sadly, many other examples could be cited. However, the facts of legitimate history revealed that it was Bible-believing Christians who developed the discipline of science and technology in response to God's command to have dominion over his creation. You see, God's creation was entrusted to us to care for as wise stewards. Genesis 2:15, honoring our Creator and benefiting mankind. This brings us to what is called the dominion mandate in Genesis 1:26. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Now, with a proper definition of science, we can and must watch out for science falsely so called, but not reject the legitimate and good fruit of science and technology which humanity was actually commanded to develop and to share. Now, above we had stated that the universe and you were created for God's good purpose. So here, with all this in view, I will offer an acrostic tool I created to share what I believe is truly compelling evidence for faith in biblical creation. We can be confident of this approach because God has laid the foundation for this form of apologetic. According to Romans 1:19 through 20, for what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made, so they are without excuse. Once again, we recognize that scientific proofs for origin theories are not valid. This is true for both the evolutionary account of origins and the creation account of our origins. By definition, proof is something science can never provide. Therefore, I will offer a cumulative logical case for biblical creation using the following 7-letter acrostic, created. The first letter is C for creation of science. Concepts found in the Bible motivated the very development of the discipline of science by which experimental evidence is acquired. Historians of science now acknowledge that the scientific method itself and most all the major disciplines of science were developed because of beliefs uniquely found in the Bible. 3 of the key beliefs were: 1. Because man was created in the image of God, he can think the thoughts of God after him. 2. Because God established laws for the affairs of man, there should be laws for the affairs of nature. And 3, the dominion mandate given in Genesis 1:26 ultimately led to the development of science and technology. So let's review some of these Bible-believing scientists and the disciplines they founded. First, right there at the top are Francis Bacon and René Descartes. Their methods synthesized together comprise what is properly defined as the scientific method. And now those disciplines. First is dynamics with Isaac Newton, astronomy, Johann Kepler, chemistry, Robert Boyle, thermodynamics, Lord Kelvin, bacteriology, Louis Pasteur, oceanography, Matthew Murray, electromagnetics, Michael Faraday, electrodynamics, Clerk Maxwell, biology, John Ray, taxonomy, Carolus Linnaeus. Now the next letters are for root of life. In 1864, Louis Pasteur scientifically established the law of biogenesis, that is, all life comes from life. Evolutionists have never offered a satisfactory solution for the origin of life from non-life. The evidence in the fossil record always shows sudden appearance and stability of types. The best explanation for the appearance of complex life observed at every level, amoeba to man, is intelligent design. The next letter is E for entropy and the first and second laws of thermodynamics. These two most fundamental laws of science were predicted by the biblical view of origins. The first law states that nothing can now be created or destroyed. Instead, all things are being conserved. The second law states that everything naturally goes from order to disorder, from hot to cold. All things are degenerating, or as it says in Romans 8:21, all things are in bondage to corruption. This is entropy. The fact that the universe cannot be some kind of perpetual motion machine which is both organized and energized for eternity is demanded by these two most fundamental laws of science and the Bible. Evolution does not predict, but actually contradicts both of these essential laws of science. Therefore, the Patent Office does not grant patents for perpetual motion machines. They are not allowed. The next letter is A for ancient fossils. The insight that the biblical flood was a sufficient and necessary cause for ancient fossils and the geologic column was set forth in the groundbreaking book, The Genesis Flood, the Biblical Record and its Scientific Implications by John Whitcomb and Henry M. Morris. No other historical theory, past or present, explains so well the causes and effects shaping Earth history. Recognizing this, Ken Ham reminds us of the evidence we should expect for the Genesis flood. He says it would be billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. And when we look, what do we find? Well, billions of dead things buried in rock layers laid down by water all over the earth. The next letter is T for types and created kinds. Motivated by the biblical description of creation, Carolus Linnaeus developed the scientific classification system for all life into distinct types called the Linnaean naming system using binomial Latin nomenclature. In Genesis 1:12, each created type yields fruit whose seed is in itself according to its kind. This is precisely what is observed in all of nature, yet the amoeba to man macroevolution concept requires small step changes in a continuum which we do not observe anywhere in the living or fossil record. No combinations of any of the basic kinds are ever observed, and so never anything like a cat dog, or as he says here, non-licit, or we might say in English, it's not allowed. The next letter is E for encoded DNA is fully functional. In 1953, scientists discovered the most basic structure of the code of life in every cell, DNA. Yet for the following 50 years, evolutionary ideas motivated a theory of junk DNA, the supposed leftovers from millions of years of random mutation. After the Human Genome Project in 2003 found only 3 to 5% of DNA coded for proteins, this was unjustifiably used as proof for evolution, and the majority of DNA was assigned junk status. Then in 2012, the ENCODE research project revealed this evolutionary prediction was dead wrong. The vast majority of DNA, over 80%, was then known to serve many functions essential to life. Today that figure is more like 100%. This reversal repeats the previous evolutionary error of vestigial organs as leftovers of evolution. The recurring errors of evolution, not to mention the metaphor that DNA is fully encoded, should not be forgotten by those who question the anti-scientific predictions of evolution. The last letter is D for designed intelligently for a purpose. The whole history of observation has led to one and only one reasonable conclusion. Life is masterfully designed. Even the new atheists acknowledge that life, quote, appears to be designed, yet they insist that Darwin's design substitute, uniformitarianism and natural selection, can create complexity by chance from chaos. Today we know better. With the 4 billion bits of information in human DNA, our biological systems, organs, cells, organelles, and even the proteins are all irreducibly complex. In view of all these facts, not only is the chance origin of life fantastically improbable, it's impossible. And according to the Bible, God created you as his wonderful work with a purpose. As Psalm 139 says, you are fearfully and wonderfully made. So, for those interested in the detailed evidence supporting these 7 principles, you can find these on my website for the article titled Created, all caps. Now for the application of these compelling truths. As I shared at the beginning, the reason for apologetics is to remove barriers people may have for faith in the good news about the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I believe that God reveals any and all compelling evidence. This conviction motivated me to create my website and blog, thingsrevealed.net. On the left is the main page, and on the right is a cascade of just a handful of pages that represent dozens and dozens of articles on many different topics. I encourage you to consider those. This was inspired by the scriptures and my personal experience. The scripture, Deuteronomy 29:29. The secret things belong to the Lord our God, but the things revealed belong to us and our children forever, that we may follow all the words of this law. You see, there are many things we cannot know because they are the purview of God alone. Yet there are wonderful and essential things for life that God has chosen to reveal to us by his grace. These we may thank God for, and as children of God, faithfully follow his revealed word. Now, it may well be that the single best evidence you could ever share is your own personal testimony of God's work in your life. No one can ever really refute the fact of a changed life. According to Revelation 12:11, believers have authority in this, the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony. Now, my own experience of compelling evidence was defined by an event on May 18th of 1980, the volcanic eruption of Mount St. Helens. On that day, I was working in my professional recording studio in Bothell, Washington, when I got a phone call from a friend. He said, "Tim, have you seen the explosion of Mount St. Helens?" I responded, "Well, yes, I'm looking at it right now on the television." He came back, "No, Tim, you need to walk outside, look south, and see it with your own eyes." So I walked out, and when I looked down Bothell Everett Highway, it seemed that volcano was at the end of the highway and towering up and over everything. Like a ground fault, an unnerving question shook me. I wonder if there is a God. Now, the reason this was unnerving is because just a few months before, I told a friend, I don't even believe there is a God. And this took me back a decade earlier when my teenage friends and I were in trouble with drugs and making some very bad decisions. I was introduced to what were called the Jesus people. They shared the gospel with me and I accepted it with joy. I felt like everything was now going to change. But sadly, I was like that rocky soil. I was very shallow. A short time later, a friend offered to smoke some marijuana, and I remember the previous elation being replaced by a drug high. Soon after, I completely forgot my professed faith and began making even worse decisions. In time, 3 of my best friends died because of those decisions, and I nearly lost my own life as well. Now it was 10 years later, and I was considering the serious implications if there really was a God. But then these words formed in my thoughts: "Be still and know that I am God." Now I had no idea where to find answers, so I started searching bookstores and grabbing whatever books I could find. Pretty much everything was on the table. My process was this: read until reject. I paged through one after another until concluding that is not it. I went on this way for quite a while, but realized I was just getting more confused. Then one day I made a rash decision. I walked to a church on a Sunday morning. When I met the greeter, I told her I'd never been in a church or read the Bible. So what should I do? She responded, "Well, you need to go into the new believers class." There I was presented with a thin green booklet with 10 weekly lessons of scriptures about the Christian life, and at the end of each there were a few verses to memorize. Then I began attending church services where I learned many new things, like David, a man after God's own heart. I knew that was not my heart. I had an unfaithful heart. And then I began to learn about Jesus and his holy, loving, pure, and self-sacrificing life. I was powerfully drawn to this completely different way of living, and I thought to myself, I really want to live that kind of life. I wanted to follow Jesus, but I soon discovered I had no power to do the things he had done. Further, my friends and family noticed my unsteadiness and warned me to turn away from, quote, religion. Instead, I kept attending church and learning more about the scriptures. One study concluded with memorizing Psalm 46:1, which says, God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Well, I knew I was in trouble, and of course I needed refuge, so I thought this is a good thing. But then I made a decisive choice. I decided to read the context. It says, God is a refuge and strength and ever-present help in trouble. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth give way, and the mountains fall into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and the foam, and the mountains quake with their surging. Then when I skip down to verse 10, it says, be still and know that I am God. In that moment, I realized that God had been talking to me all these years, and now he's spoken to me through his word. Now, while this really did get my attention, I continued to struggle living this new life. Even so, I pressed on until I finally came to another study that guided me to memorize Hebrews 10:25. It says, not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together in church, as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another, and so much the more as you see the day of Christ's return approaching. For me, this could have easily been a checklist item. I was already attending church, but once again, I pressed on to understand the context. In Hebrews 10:26 through 27, it adds, if we deliberately keep on sinning after we receive the knowledge of the truth, no sacrifice for sins is left, but only a fearful expectation of judgment and a raging fire that will consume the enemies of God. In that moment, I realized my sins were separating me from God. And yes, I needed Jesus as my Savior, but he must also be my Lord. I also realized I needed to trust that he could do this in my life. After this crucial decision, the particular set of things that had stumbled me, God took out of my life. And now I was able to trust and obey him to grow in my faith in Christ. Soon I realized I needed to go to some family and friends to ask forgiveness for the bad decisions and attitudes of my past. There was one particular friend I especially needed to go to, and her name was Dorothy. So when I met with her, I said this. When we had lived together in the past, we had a real kind of love, but I had not treated you with the respect that you really deserved. Can you please forgive me for that? I'm trying to change my life. I'm trying to follow Christ. She was open to that possibility, but wanted to see where this would go. So we started to attend church together and later went to a Christian conference where she recommitted herself to her childhood faith. And as we began to grow in our faith, our pastor counseled us about the possibility of marriage. 9 months later, we are joyfully married in our church. That was now 43 years ago. Together we decided I would begin attending a Bible college and later seek a degree in physics. In all of this, I was motivated to honor God and the power and authority of his word. What I finally learned is that both the individual believer and the whole of human experience, including science, must be guided by the lordship of Jesus Christ. That is because the law of the Lord is perfect, reviving the soul. The statutes of the Lord are trustworthy, making wise the simple. Psalm 19:7. With that, allow me to offer my conclusion. The role of apologetics is not to win an argument. As it says in 2 Timothy 2:23 through 26, don't have anything to do with foolish and stupid arguments, because you know that they produce quarrels. And the Lord's servant must not quarrel. Instead, he must be kind to everyone, able to teach, not resentful. Those who oppose him he must gently instruct, in the hope that God will grant them repentance, leading them to a knowledge of the truth, and that they will come to their senses and escape from the trap of the devil, who has taken them captive to do his will. Again, the purpose of apologetics is to clear barriers to seeing and experiencing the compelling love of God in Christ. So that's what I had to share. Thank you very much. And for those interested in my website and blog, here's a QR code that will take you to the website and the various different articles that I cited and a number of different topics.